The Panteón de Belén in Guadalajara has always been a place where the barrier between the living and the dead feels unnervingly thin. In the sweltering May of 1910, Giovanni Martinelli, a seasoned marble worker of Italian descent, found his hands trembling as he applied the final strokes of his chisel to a fresh slab of Carrara marble. The rhythmic clink-clink of metal against stone was the only sound in the silent cemetery, save for the distant cooing of doves. As he wiped away the fine white dust, the name stared back at him with a permanence that made his blood run cold. Eduardo Santibáñez Mora, 1873–1910, was expected. The man had succumbed to typhoid fever only weeks prior. However, it was the second line that felt like a curse. Catalina del Valle Santibáñez, 1875–1910. Giovanni knew Catalina. He had seen her only days ago, draped in mourning black, her eyes heavy with grief, but her pulse very much alive. To carve a death date for a woman who still breathed the humid air of the Jalisco spring felt less like an artisan's task and more like a dark prophecy. He looked around the desolate graveyard, half expecting a phantom to emerge, but found only the heavy, expectant silence of a city on the brink of a revolution. The sun was a punishing weight upon the shoulders of Catalina del Valle as she made her way through the narrow, cobbled streets of Guadalajara. Every Thursday she followed the same ritual, carrying a bundle of white gladiolas that seemed to wilt under the intense heat. At 35, Catalina was a woman of striking but fading beauty, her honey-colored eyes clouded by the sudden loss of Eduardo, the man who had been her anchor for 13 years. As she entered the gates of the Panteón de Belén, the smell of damp earth and rotting flowers greeted her, a sensory reminder of her new reality as a widow. She navigated the rows of ornate mausoleums and modest crosses until she reached the Santibáñez plot. Kneeling on the dry soil, she began to arrange the flowers, her lips moving in a silent prayer. It was then that her gaze shifted to the newly installed headstone. The letters were crisp, the marble pristine, but the message was a nightmare. Her own name was etched into the stone, alongside the same year of death as her husband. 1910. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She reached out, her fingers tracing the cold, deep grooves of the sea in Catalina, waiting for the stone to vanish like a hallucination. It did not. The marble was solid, indifferent, and terrifyingly final. The sheer impossibility of the situation left Catalina paralyzed. In the rigid social structures of 1910 Mexico, errors were made, but an error of this magnitude, a living woman declared dead in stone, suggested something far more sinister than a stonemason's oversight. Guadalajara was currently a powder keg of political tension. Francisco Fermadero had recently issued the Plan de San Luis, and while the Porfirian elite attempted to maintain a facade of order, the whispers of rebellion were growing into a roar in the countryside. For a woman of the middle class who had married into the prestigious Santibáñez family, Catalina had always been an outsider. Her father, Ignacio del Valle, had seen his textile empire crumble under the weight of Porfirian tariffs, leaving Catalina to rely on her skill as a bordadora, an exceptional embroiderer, to maintain her family's dignity. Her marriage to Eduardo had been a scandal of the heart, a union based on genuine affection that defied the cold calculations of the upper class. Now, standing before her own grave, she realized that the protection Eduardo had provided was gone. The heavy silence of the cemetery felt like a shroud, and for the first time she wondered if the Santibáñez family hadn't just buried Eduardo, but were in the process of burying her as well. Memory offered a cruel contrast to her current terror, drifting back to the Corpus Christi Mass of 1895. It was there that Eduardo Santibáñez Mora first laid eyes on her. He was the heir to a fortune of pulque haciendas and urban estates, a man destined for the heights of Tapatía society. Catalina had been 20, wearing a lavender cotton dress she had meticulously embroidered with violets so lifelike they seemed to emit a fragrance. Eduardo had been captivated by her quiet dignity and the way she held her head high despite her worn shoes. Their courtship had been a 2-year battle against the formidable Doña Socorro Mora de Santibáñez, a matriarch who believed her son deserved a bride of noble lineage, not the daughter of a failed merchant. Despite his mother's fury, Eduardo remained stubborn, his romantic nature proving to be both his greatest virtue and his most dangerous trait. They married in 1897 in a ceremony that was the talk of the town, not for its opulence but for the glaring absence of the groom's mother. For 13 years, their home on San Francisco Street had been a sanctuary of laughter and light, filled with 3 children and the rhythmic hum of Catalina's embroidery workshop. But beneath that happiness, a storm had been brewing in the Santibáñez mansion on Maestranza Street. Doña Socorro was a woman who never forgot a slight and never forgave an intrusion. To her, Catalina was a thief who had stolen the family's golden son and diluted their prestigious bloodline. For over a decade, she had methodically worked to undermine the marriage, weaving a web of poisonous rumors that questioned Catalina's virtue and the legitimacy of her children. Beside her stood Hortensia, Eduardo's older sister, a woman whose own bitterness had made her the perfect instrument for her mother's malice. Hortensia would visit Catalina under the guise of sisterly concern, her words always laced with subtle barbs meant to erode Catalina's confidence. As 1910 dawned, the atmosphere within the family reached a boiling point. Eduardo had begun to modernize his views, allowing Catalina to manage her own finances and run her workshop with independence, acts that Doña Socorro viewed as an unforgivable betrayal of tradition. The family's wealth was vast, but the control of it was a game of shadows. When Eduardo first complained of stomach pains in January, no one suspected that the internal politics of the Santibáñez clan had shifted from verbal attacks to something far more physical. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would be written in blood and finalized in cold marble. The decline of Eduardo was a harrowing ordeal that transformed their vibrant home into a house of shadows. What began as simple indigestion quickly spiraled into intermittent fevers, night sweats, and a terrifying progressive weakness. Dr. Cardenas, the longtime physician of the Santibáñez family, was quick to diagnose typhoid fever, a common enough scourge in the era, and prescribed absolute bed rest. Catalina threw herself into the role of nurse, her hands, once famous for their delicate needlework, now occupied with dampening cloths for Eduardo's burning forehead and preparing broths he could barely swallow. Day and night, she remained by his side, praying through endless rosaries as his skin took on a sickly grayish hue and his eyes sank deep into their sockets. In his delirium, Eduardo would call out for his mother and siblings, his voice a rasping shadow of its former self. On the 15th of April 1910, the light finally left him. He died, clutching Catalina's hand, his last words a frantic whisper that she could never quite make sense of, though they haunted her every waking moment. The funeral was a grand, somber affair, a parade of the city's elite who came to offer hollow condolences while Doña Socorro played the part of the grieving matriarch to perfection, casting accusatory glances at the widow. In the aftermath of the funeral, a suffocating isolation began to settle over Catalina. Her children, now young adults with lives of their own, seemed distant, pulled away by the gravity of their grandmother's influence. Eduardo Jr. returned to Michoacán, Maria de la Luz to the capital, and Ignacio to his law studies, leaving Catalina alone in the house on San Francisco Street, except for Hortensia. Her sister-in-law had moved in under the pretext of providing support, but her presence felt more like that of a jailer. Catalina soon noticed that the desk in Eduardo's study had been tampered with, ledgers were missing, and legal documents she knew existed had simply vanished. Whenever she entered a room, hushed conversations between Hortensia and visiting men of business would abruptly cease. There was a frantic energy to the way they pushed her to sign papers, claiming it was merely to simplify the inheritance. It was this growing sense of unease that finally drove her to the cemetery that fateful May morning, seeking solace at Eduardo's grave, only to find that the family had already moved on to the next phase of their plan. Looking at her own name on that stone, Catalina realized the typhoid hadn't been a random tragedy. It had been an opening act. Catalina's knees buckled as the weight of the revelation crashed over her like a physical blow. The Azabache rosary beads she had been holding slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering against the marble surface before scattering across the dry earth like a line of panicked black ants. She reached out, her fingertips tracing the sharp, cold edges of the letters that spelled out her own doom. The craftsmanship was impeccable. There was no room for the comfort of a mistake. The dates were precise, 1875, 1910. According to the stone, she was already a memory, a woman whose time had expired alongside her husband's. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic reminder of her vitality that seemed to mock the silent permanence of the grave. The air in the Panthéon de Belém grew suddenly thin, suffocatingly hot, and the silence that had once been peaceful now felt like a predatory presence. She looked around the empty cemetery, searching for the stonemason or a groundskeeper, anyone who could explain why her life had been signed away in Carrara marble. But the graveyard remained a desert of white monuments and indifferent shadows, leaving her alone with her own headstone. Desperate for a voice of reason, Catalina stumbled toward the cemetery's small chapel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She found Father Anselmo kneeling before the altar, the smell of frankincense and old wood offering a momentary sense of sanctuary. However, when she gripped his arm and dragged him toward the Santibáñez plot, the priest's reaction was not one of shock, but of a devastating, mournful recognition. As he stared at the dual inscription, his face paled, and he crossed himself with a hand that shook visibly. When Catalina demanded an explanation, he refused to meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on the ground as if the stone itself were a holy edict he dared not question. "Hija mía," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and a terror that chilled her to the bone. "It is not my place to explain the mysteries of the family. Go home. Speak to Doña Socorro. May God have mercy on your soul, for the world of men has already made its decision." He retreated into the shadows of the chapel, leaving her with the realization that even the church had been recruited into this silent conspiracy. The 2-kilometer walk back to the house on San Francisco Street felt like a journey through an alien landscape. Guadalajara, the city of her birth, had transformed into a theater of masks. Every pedestrian she passed, every vendor hawking wares in the plaza seemed to be part of a grand play where she was the only one who didn't know her lines. The political tension of May 1910 hung heavy in the air. The Porfirian regime was cracking, and the wealthy families were tightening their grip on whatever they still controlled. Catalina felt a growing sense of invisibility. When she reached the heavy oak doors of her home, she found Hortensia standing in the central patio, framed by the pink quarry stone arches. Her sister-in-law wore a faint, inscrutable smile that never reached her cold eyes. "What a long time you took at the cemetery, dear," Hortensia remarked, her tone conversational yet sharp as a blade. "One would think you were trying to move in early." Catalina said nothing, pushing past her and locking herself in her room, the echoes of that cruel jest ringing in her ears like a funeral bell. Sleep was an impossibility that night. In the oppressive darkness of her bedchamber, Catalina began to piece together the fragments of the past few months. She realized that her isolation hadn't been an accident of grief, but a calculated strategy. She crept to Eduardo's study, her movements silent as a shadow, and began to search for the legal documents he had always kept secure. The drawers were empty. The private ledgers that detailed their urban properties and the children's trust funds had been systematically purged. Even the small compartment where Eduardo kept his personal correspondence had been pried open, leaving behind only splinters of wood and a void where their history used to be. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She was being erased. Without those documents, she was no longer a widow with rights. She was a guest in a house that was being claimed by a matriarch who had spent 13 years waiting for this exact moment of vulnerability. The Santibáñez name was a fortress, and she was being pushed outside its walls. The following morning, Catalina sought out the one person she believed might still honor the law, Ramiro Ponce de León, the family's longtime notary. His office on Juárez Street was a cramped, dusty maze of paper and ink, but the man himself was the picture of Porfirian elegance. When Catalina sat across from him and mentioned the headstone, the notary's composed facade crumbled. He avoided her gaze, shuffling papers with frantic energy. He informed her, in a voice that lacked all conviction, that all of Eduardo's affairs had been consolidated under the authority of Doña Socorro to ensure the stability of the family legacy. When she pressed him about her own legal status, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Señora, I implore you to accept the generosity the family offers and ask no more questions. There are forces at work here that go beyond property lines. In these times of revolution, a person can vanish as easily as a signature on a page. Do not force them to make the marble a reality." As the days bled into weeks, the social fabric of Catalina's life began to unravel. The neighbors who had once greeted her with warmth now crossed the street to avoid her path, their faces clouded with a mixture of guilt and superstition. The wealthy ladies of Guadalajara stopped sending their fine linens to her workshop, and her once thriving embroidery business withered into nothingness. Even her regular confessor at the Church of San Jose offered no solace, instead speaking in riddles about preparing the soul for the inevitable and putting one's earthly affairs in order. It was as if the city had collectively decided to mourn her while she was still standing. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, a living dead woman whose existence was an inconvenience to the social order. The psychological pressure was immense, designed to break her spirit until she either fled the city or succumbed to the madness they were so carefully projecting onto her. Driven by a desperate need to understand why, Catalina began to dig into the secrets Eduardo had hinted at in his final delirious days. She discovered that the Santibáñez fortune was a hollow shell. The vast haciendas were mortgaged to foreign banks, and the family was drowning in debt. But the true danger lay in a hidden ledger she found tucked behind a loose brick in the servants' quarters, a record of illegal arms smuggling. Doña Socorro and her younger son, Sebastián, had been profiting from the brewing revolution, selling stolen federal weapons to the Maderista insurgents. It was a treasonous double game that would lead to the firing squad if the Porfirian government found out, or a bloody execution if the revolutionaries felt cheated. Eduardo had discovered the scheme and threatened to expose them to save the family's honor. His typhoid had not been a disease of the water, but a disease of the blood, a slow, systematic poisoning administered by the very people who shared his name. The final confirmation came on a humid June evening. Catalina was huddled in the hallway, hidden by the heavy velvet curtains, when she overheard a hushed conversation between Hortensia and Sebastian in the library. Their voices were cold, clinical, as if they were discussing the disposal of a piece of unwanted furniture. "She's found the ledger," Sebastian hissed, his voice taut with suppressed violence. "The doctor says she's becoming a liability. We can't wait for her to fade away naturally anymore." Hortensia's response was a chilling whisper that made the hair on Catalina's neck stand up. "Mother says it is time. The preparations at the cemetery are already finished. The name is there, the dates are set. Dr. Cardenas has the same medicine ready that we gave to Eduardo. No one will question a widow dying of the same fever that took her husband. It's poetic justice." Catalina retreated to her room, her heart a drum of war. She was no longer just a victim of an inheritance scam. She was a witness to murder and treason, and her own execution was scheduled for the coming dawn. The realization that Dr. Cardenas was the executioner made every sip of water and every morsel of food feel like a gamble with death. She looked at the medicine bottles on her nightstand, the tonics prescribed for her nerves, and saw them for what they were, vials of arsenic and slow-acting toxins. The Santibáñez family didn't just want her dead, they wanted her death to be a confirmation of their own power over reality. They had carved her end in stone to prove that they owned time itself. In the rigid patriarchal world of 1910 Mexico, a woman in her position had no recourse, no protector, and no escape. Or so they thought. As she watched the moon rise over the spires of the cathedral, Catalina del Valle made a choice. If she was already a ghost in their eyes, she would use the shadows to her advantage. She would not wait for the fever to take her. She would disappear on her own terms, turning their marble prophecy into a riddle that would haunt the Santibáñez name for a century to come. The moon over Guadalajara on the night of June 2nd, 1910 was a sliver of pale bone, casting long, distorted shadows across the patio of the house on San Francisco Street. Inside her bedchamber, Catalina del Valle did not sleep. Instead, she moved with the silent precision of the master embroiderer she was, stitching a final desperate plan into the fabric of her reality. She knew that the medicine Dr. Cardenas intended to deliver at dawn was a one-way ticket to the Panteón de Belén. Her trunk was packed not with clothes, but with the few remnants of her life that the Santibáñez family had not yet plundered. A small pouch of gold coins Eduardo had hidden for an emergency, her finest sewing needles, and the hidden ledger that detailed the family's treasonous arms smuggling. She understood that she could not save her children. They were currently under the suffocating protection of Doña Socorro at the family hacienda, but she could save the truth. To stay was to die a slow, agonizing death by arsenic. To leave was to become a shadow in a country already darkening with the clouds of the coming revolution. As the first hint of grey touched the horizon, Catalina slipped out of the master suite, her footsteps muffled by the heavy wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She navigated the house by touch, avoiding the floorboards she knew would groan under her weight. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the lingering malaise of Eduardo's long illness. When she reached the kitchen, she encountered Jacinta, the Zapotec laundress who had been her only true confidant in that house of vipers. Jacinta didn't gasp or cry out. She merely looked at Catalina with eyes that had seen centuries of injustice. Without a word, the older woman handed her a bundle of tortillas and a jug of water. "The black carriage is already circling the plaza, Niña," Jacinta whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "They do not wait for the fever anymore. They have grown impatient." Catalina realized then that her disappearance was being orchestrated from both sides. She was trying to flee a cage that was already being dismantled to make room for her coffin. The escape through the servants' entrance led her into a Guadalajara that felt like a fever dream. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional patrol of Porfirian rurales, whose spurs jingled rhythmically against the cobblestones. Catalina moved toward the San Juan de Dios market district, hoping to lose herself among the dawn vendors and the early morning bustle of the working class. However, as she crossed the Calzada Independencia, the rhythmic clatter of hooves grew louder behind her. A black carriage, devoid of any family crest or identifying marks, emerged from the morning mist like a predatory spectre. It didn't move like a public transport. It moved with a calculated, menacing intent. Catalina quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the carriage accelerated, cutting her off at the corner of a narrow alleyway. Two men, their faces obscured by the shadows of their wide-brimmed hats, stepped down. They didn't speak. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who were paid to make problems vanish. Back at the house on San Francisco Street, the discovery of Catalina's absence was performed with the theatrical precision of a high society opera. Hortensia entered the bedroom at precisely 7 in the morning, carrying a tray of tea and the medicine provided by Dr. Cardenas. When she found the bed empty and the window ajar, her screams were perfectly pitched to alert the household and the neighbors. Within an hour, the Santibáñez machinery was in full motion. They didn't report a kidnapping. They reported the tragic flight of a mind broken by grief. Doña Socorro arrived shortly after, draped in lace and righteous indignation, informing the local authorities that her poor, delusional daughter-in-law had been speaking of seeing her name on tombstones and had likely wandered off to fulfill a suicidal impulse. By framing Catalina as a woman lost to madness, they ensured that any future sightings of her would be dismissed as the hallucinations of a lunatic or the wanderings of a ghost. The official investigation was a masterpiece of Porfirian corruption. Commander Porfirio Estrada, a man whose loyalty had been bought by the Santibáñez family years prior, took charge of the case. He spent less than 30 minutes in the house, choosing to ignore the signs of a forced struggle near the alleyway and the testimony of the street vendors who had seen a woman being coerced into a black carriage. Instead, he focused on the evidence provided by the family, a forged suicide note and the testimony of Dr. Cardenas, who claimed Catalina was suffering from melancholic hysteria. Estrada concluded his report by stating that the widow had likely thrown herself into the San Juan de Dios River, which was swollen from the recent rains. The message to the public was clear. Catalina del Valle was no longer a person. She was a tragedy that had reached its inevitable conclusion. The law had not failed her. It had been weaponized against her. In the legal offices of the city, a second, more permanent erasure was taking place. Judge Octavio Camarena, an intimate friend of the Santibáñez clan, presided over a closed-door hearing to settle the urgent matter of the estate. Using the police report of her presumed death and the very headstone that had terrified Catalina in the Panteón de Belén as physical proof of the family's preparedness for the inevitable, the judge moved with startling speed. Within days, Catalina was declared legally dead. This bureaucratic execution was more effective than any poison. It stripped her of her name, her properties, and her right to exist in the eyes of the state. Her children's inheritance was moved into a trust controlled entirely by Doña Socorro, and the Santibáñez debts began to vanish as they liquidated the urban properties that Eduardo had once intended for his wife's security. In the ledgers of Guadalajara, Catalina was a closed chapter, a line of ink that had been blotted out. Despite the family's efforts to silence the world, the truth survived in the hushed corners of the city. Jacinta, the laundress, became a silent witness to the crime that the elites refused to acknowledge. She had seen the struggle. She had seen the way the men in the black carriage handled the niña like a sack of grain. For years, Jacinta would tell the story to those who would listen, the laborers, the water carriers, the other invisible people of Guadalajara. She spoke of how the Santibáñez family had stolen the señora's breath before God was ready for it. This grassroots narrative created a counter-history, a folk legend of the widow of Belén that haunted the family's reputation even as they flourished in the upper echelons of society. To the rich, she was a tragic suicide. To the poor, she was a woman buried alive by the greed of a dying aristocracy. The final act of social erasure was the Requiem Mass held at the cathedral. It was a somber, star-studded event where the elite of Jalisco gathered to mourn a woman they had spent the last month shunned. Doña Socorro sat in the front pew, a pillar of tragic grace, while Hortensia wept into a silk handkerchief that Catalina herself had once embroidered. There was no coffin, only a symbolic cenotaph covered in white gladiolas. The irony was lost on no one. The family was mourning a woman they had effectively murdered, using the church to sanctify their lies. As the incense rose toward the vaulted ceiling, the memory of the real Catalina, the vibrant, talented woman who loved her children and fought for her dignity, was replaced by the image of the unstable widow. By the time the final Amen was whispered, the Santibáñez family had succeeded in burying Catalina del Valle in the one place from which no one ever returns, the fabricated past. The black carriage did not deliver Catalina to a final resting place, but to a living purgatory. While the elites of Guadalajara were whispering prayers for her soul in the cathedral, the woman herself was being dragged into the humid, subterranean depths of a remote ranch near Tlaquepaque. This property, owned by Sebastián Santibáñez under a shell company, was a world away from the refined arches of the city. Here, the air was thick with the scent of wet stone and the metallic tang of old blood. Catalina was cast into a windowless cellar, a space originally designed for the cool storage of pulque, now repurposed as a cage. The floor was packed earth, and the only light came from the flickering torch of her captors. As the heavy, iron-bolted door slammed shut, the finality of the sound was more devastating than the sight of her own headstone. She was no longer a mother, a widow, or an artist. She was a secret kept behind 4 feet of reinforced masonry, a biological anomaly that the Santibáñez family needed to correct through silence and slow attrition. Inside that subterranean tomb, the days lost their shape, dissolving into a singular, unending twilight. Catalina's captors were men of few words, their faces hardened by a life of enforcing the Santibáñez will. They brought her meager rations of corn and water, but the true torture was the psychological warfare orchestrated by Sebastián. He visited her once a week, his boots echoing with a terrifying rhythm on the stone stairs. He didn't want her dead immediately. He wanted the location of the documents Eduardo had hidden and her signature on a full renunciation of her rights. "You are already dead, Catalina," he would hiss, his face inches from hers. "The world has seen your grave. Your children have forgotten the sound of your voice. To sign these papers is merely to agree with the marble." Catalina, despite the cold and the hunger, clung to her defiance. She used the sharp edges of her fingernails to scratch marks into the mortar between the stones, 1 mark for every day she remained a witness to their crimes. The world above her began to fracture as the Mexican Revolution of 1910 ignited into a full-scale conflagration. Even in the depths of her cell, Catalina could feel the tremors of change. The frequency of Sebastián's visits decreased, and when he did appear, he was no longer composed. The Santibáñez family's double-dealing, selling arms to both the federal forces of Porfirio Díaz and the Maderista rebels, was becoming a lethal game. The revolutionary fire was consuming the countryside, and the family's haciendas were becoming targets. Rumors filtered down through the guards, whispers of the Plan de San Luis, of peasant uprisings, and of a world where the old surnames no longer provided immunity. Catalina realized that the chaos was her only ally. If the social order that allowed her erasure were to fall, perhaps she could rise from the grave they had built for her. She began to save her strength, eating every scrap of food and mentally reciting the patterns of her embroidery to keep her mind sharp against the creeping damp of madness. In February of 1911, a flicker of hope appeared in the form of a federal military patrol led by Sergeant Prospero Aguirre. The soldiers were searching for a cache of stolen rifles that had been traced to the Tlaquepaque area. When they arrived at the ranch, the guards panicked, attempting to hide the evidence of their illegal activities. Aguirre, a man of keen intuition and little patience for the local landed gentry, insisted on a full inspection of the outbuildings. As he paced the floor above the cellar, Catalina heard the heavy tread of his boots and the jingle of his spurs. She screamed, throwing herself against the door, her voice a raw, desperate rasp. But the guards had anticipated this. They turned up a phonograph in the main hall, the loud, scratchy strains of an opera drowning out her cries. Aguirre found a cellar full of empty crates and a few suspicious stains on the floor, but he found no woman. He left the ranch with a sense of unease that would haunt him for 13 years, unaware that he had been standing inches away from the city's most famous ghost. The close call with the military patrol convinced the Santibáñez family that Catalina was a liability they could no longer afford to keep in Jalisco. Fearing that a more thorough search would eventually uncover her, they decided to move her under the cover of the increasing revolutionary turmoil. On a night of driving rain, she was blindfolded, gagged, and thrown into the back of a grain wagon. The journey was a blur of bumps and muffled voices, lasting for days as they bypassed the main roads to avoid insurgent checkpoints. Eventually, the air grew thinner and colder, and the scent of the sea was replaced by the dry, mineral smell of the Central Highlands. She was delivered to a cloistered convent in León, Guanajuato, an institution that survived on the charity of families like the Santibáñez. The Mother Superior, a woman whose devotion to order far outweighed her devotion to mercy, accepted Catalina as Maria Soledad, a relative of the family suffering from holy madness who required total isolation for her own salvation. Life in the convent was a different kind of imprisonment. Catalina was no longer in chains, but she was trapped within a labyrinth of silence and prayer. She was forced to cut her hair and wear the coarse wool of a penitent. However, her extraordinary hands, the hands that had once made silk flowers bloom, became her greatest asset. The convent's primary income came from selling liturgical vestments, and Maria Soledad soon became the most productive embroiderer in the cloisters. She worked in a small, barred room, her needle moving with a frantic energy. Hidden within the intricate gold thread of the bishop's robes and the altar cloths, she began to stitch her truth. In the tiny, invisible patterns of the vine leaves and the holy symbols, she embroidered the name Catalina and the date 1910. It was a silent, beautiful rebellion, a way of scattering her identity across the churches of Mexico, hoping that one day someone with a keen eye would see the message hidden in the sacred silk. As the revolution reached a fever pitch in 1911, the Santibáñez family's control over the narrative began to slip. The death of Sebastian in a skirmish with rebels and the mounting debts of Doña Socorro meant that the payments to the convent became irregular. Catalina, now weakened by a severe bout of pneumonia, was treated by a local physician, Dr. Hermenildo Vargas. In her state of delirium, the walls she had built around her secret crumbled. She spoke of the Pantheon de Belén, of the marble slab with her name, and of the husband who had been poisoned by his own mother. Vargas, a man of science who harbored a deep-seated distrust of the aristocracy, listened with growing horror. He saw the lunar-shaped birthmark under her eye and the scars on her fingertips, marks that didn't belong to a mad woman, but to a woman who had fought for her life. When she recovered, he confronted her, and for the first time in a year, Catalina del Valle told her story to someone who believed she was still among the living. The risk of exposure was now greater than ever. Dr. Vargas knew that if he moved too quickly, the Santibáñez influence, even in its diminished state, could have them both killed. He began to plan a way to smuggle her out of the convent and into the safety of the revolutionary camps, where the old laws of the Porfirian elite held no sway. But the shadows were long, and Doña Socorro's spies were everywhere. The matriarch, sensing that her Maria Soledad's secret was unraveling, issued a final, desperate command. If Catalina could not be kept in the grave of the Pantheon de Belén, she would be buried in an anonymous pit where no one would ever find her. As the sun set over the spires of León, Catalina realized that the doctor's help might be a day too late. The black carriage had returned, and this time there would be no more ceremonies, no more documents, and no more marble. Only the cold, final silence of the dark. The night of the final confrontation in Leon was defined by a terrifying symmetry. As the black carriage waited at the convent gates, a manifestation of Doña Socorro's unrelenting reach, the winds of the revolution finally tore through the city. Dr. Hermenildo Vargas, realizing that the Santibáñez agents were coming to reclaim their Maria Soledad, acted with a bravery that contradicted his quiet academic nature. He didn't just provide medicine, he provided a diversion. Using a local network of Maderista sympathizers, he orchestrated a chaotic skirmish on the outskirts of the convent grounds. In the confusion of smoke, shouting, and the crackle of gunfire, the black carriage was forced to retreat, and the woman the world called Catalina vanished into the shifting tides of the war. There were no witnesses to her departure, no records of her travels. Like a thread pulled from a tapestry, she simply ceased to be part of the visible world, leaving behind only the empty cell and a final, unfinished altarcloth that bore the name of a dead woman. The subsequent fate of Catalina del Valle remains one of Mexico's most haunting enigmas. While the Santibáñez family continued to maintain the fiction of her 1910 suicide, reports of a woman matching her description began to emerge from the heart of the revolutionary camps. Soldiers spoke of a silent, grey-haired woman with the hands of a saint who could stitch a wound as perfectly as she could embroider a banner. These sightings were never officially confirmed, for Catalina had learned the ultimate lesson of the Panteón de Belén. In a world where the powerful can decree your death, true safety lies in anonymity. Whether she died in a nameless camp in 1915 or lived to see the dawn of a new Mexico under a different name, she achieved the one thing Doña Socorro could not steal: her own narrative. She became the woman who survived her own grave, a living testament to the fact that the human spirit is far more resilient than the marble meant to contain it. As the revolution ground the old Porfirian order to dust, the Santibáñez empire began to crumble from within, as if cursed by the very lies they had etched in stone. Sebastián, the architect of the arms smuggling and the jailer of Tlaquepaque, was executed by a revolutionary tribunal in 1915 after his double dealings were finally exposed. He died in a muddy ditch, far from the luxury he had murdered to protect. Hortensia, left alone in the echoing halls of the house on Maestranza Street, descended into a bitter, hallucinatory madness. Neighbors whispered that she would spend her nights pacing the corridors, screaming at the walls that Catalina is coming through the plaster. By the time she died in 1945, the family fortune had been entirely liquidated to pay for her care and to settle the debts Doña Socorro had accumulated. The name Santibáñez, once a symbol of untouchable power, became a cautionary tale of greed and the rot that hid behind a prestigious surname. Doña Socorro Mora de Santibáñez outlived almost everyone she had sought to control. She died in 1928, a matriarch of nearly 80 years, surrounded by the hollow remnants of her status. Her death was a grand social event, complete with a hagiographic obituario that described her as a pillar of Catholic virtue and a devoted mother. She was buried in the family plot at the Panteón de Belén, just a few feet away from the empty grave she had commissioned for her daughter-in-law. It is said that in her final hours, she refused to close her eyes, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for a guest who never arrived. She took the secret of Catalina's fate to her grave, never confessing to the poisoning of her son or the abduction of his wife. She died believing she had won, unaware that the true history of her family was being whispered in every kitchen and market stall in Guadalajara, kept alive by the very people she had considered beneath her notice. The medical accomplice, Dr. Cardenas, found no such peace. Haunted by the weight of his sins and the terrifying memory of Eduardo's slow decline, he took his own life in 1920. He left behind a cryptic note that served as the first real crack in the Santibáñez facade, though the family's remaining influence ensured it was never used in a court of law. The children of Catalina, Eduardo Jr., Maria de la Luz, and Ignacio remained a mystery of a different kind. Whether they were truly deceived by their grandmother's lies or simply found it more convenient to accept their inheritance than to seek an uncomfortable truth is a question that haunts their descendants. They grew up in a world where their mother was a tragic shadow, a melancholic who had abandoned them. Their silence was the final, most painful layer of the masonry that kept Catalina's story buried for decades, proving that even the strongest bloodlines can be severed by a well-crafted lie. Today, the tomb in the Panteón de Belén stands as a silent witness to this historical crime. The marble has yellowed with a century of Jalisco sun, and the inscriptions have been softened by the rain, but the lie remains legible. Aquí yacen Eduardo y su amada esposa Catalina. However, the secret of the empty space is well known to the cemetery's keepers. In 1960, a local historian attempted to verify the burial records, only to find a void where the documentation should have been. Every official paper, every police report, and every death certificate related to the widow of Belen had been systematically purged from the archives during the family's peak. The grave is not a resting place. It is a cenotaph to a woman who was murdered on paper before she was ever touched by the hand of death. It serves as a grim reminder that in the history of power, the written word is often used not to record the truth, but to manufacture a more convenient reality. There was, however, one person who never allowed the marble to have the final word. Jacinta, the Zapotec laundress, remained the keeper of the true flame. Until her death in 1954, she visited the Santibáñez tomb every June 3rd, carrying the white gladiolas that Catalina had loved. But her ritual was not one of mourning, it was one of defiance. Hidden under her shawl, she carried a small chisel, and each year she would carve a tiny, almost imperceptible mark into the marble above Catalina's name. By the time she passed away, there were 44 marks, one for every year the truth had been denied. These marks are still there today, hidden in plain sight, a braille history of a crime that the law chose to ignore. They represent the 44 years Jacinta spent ensuring that Catalina's absence was noted, a quiet rebellion against the permanence of the Santibáñez lie. The story of Catalina del Valle Santibáñez is more than a ghost story or a historical mystery. It is a testament to the vulnerability of the individual against the machinery of the elite. It reminds us that, in 1910, a woman could be erased with the stroke of a pen and the carving of a stone. But it also teaches us that truth has a way of seeping through the cracks of the most solid monuments. Catalina's body may never have rested in the Panteón de Belén, but her spirit haunts the conscience of the city, a reminder of all the inconvenient women who were silenced by the families they sought to join. When you walk past that yellowed marble today, do not look at the names. Look for the small, jagged marks left by a laundress's chisel. For it is in those scratches, not in the elegant calligraphy of the stonemason, that the real history of Catalina del Valle is written, a history of a woman who refused to stay dead in a world that had already buried her.